When I was in school, I occasionally heard my Jewish friends say something along the lines of, "Hey, you know we don't believe in the devil, right?" I used to think that was weird since Satan was mentioned multiple times in the Bible, even being a central character in the book of Job, and Christians believe him to have been the snake in the Garden of Eden. But most Jews would turn around and say, "No, Satan is God's prosecutor. His job is to tempt people to test them, so that when people choose to be good, it has some actual meaning to it." I didn't spend too much thought on this, but recently a number of Jewish content creators I follow who seem to not have anything to do with each other have been bringing this up, and out of curiosity, I've fallen down a rabbit hole surrounding the origins of Satan. Now, before I get into this video, let me get a few things straight. First, this is primarily for scholarship purposes only. I know Satan and Lucifer are figures in religions that people still worship today. Don't at me. Second, my objective in exploring this stuff is to show you how to improve both your writing and your world building, so that you know how to implement this kind of mimetic mutation into your own created worlds. Let me start this discussion of the Evil One with something completely related to the topic: Medusa. In the earliest Greek myths we can find, Medusa was nothing more than a monster. She was born a Gorgon, her sisters were also Gorgons, and she had a wide array of lethal powers that depended on the story, but the most common was that she could turn people to stone with a glance. And then Ovid shows up and writes the Metamorphosis, where he decides to give Medusa a tragic backstory where she was once a beautiful woman cursed by Athena as a punishment for being assaulted by Poseidon. Why does the goddess of wisdom punish the victim with a horrific curse? Who knows? How did her sisters become Gorgons if they weren't involved? Who cares? I try not to pick on Ovid too much for reinterpreting old myths because that's a lot of what I do here, but come on, at least make the reimagining make sense. This was one of the biggest problems I had with the Percy Jackson series. Rick Riordan treats the Ovid interpretation of the myths as if they were canon, including the ones that portray Athena as either a dingbat or the real monster of the stories, but he never addressed any of the problems that this creates. How does any of this relate back to Satan and Lucifer? Well, even if it doesn't make a ton of sense, Ovid's version of Medusa took off and became incredibly popular. A lot of people today think that this version is the true story of Medusa, and he wasn't even Greek. He was a Roman. If we're going to look into the story behind Satan and Lucifer, we have to acknowledge the fact that a more popular story, even if it makes bafflingly little sense, can completely overtake the older versions of a myth. You might also be wondering why I keep referring to Satan and Lucifer, as if they were two distinctly different figures. That's because originally, they were. There is exactly one mention of Lucifer in Jewish texts that I could find, coming from Isaiah 14, verse 12. "How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning! How you are cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God, I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will be like the Most High." I've shown this verse to Jews who claim Lucifer isn't in their religion, and they usually respond with either, "That verse is being misinterpreted," or, "What? I've never seen that before." Because it's from Isaiah. And let's be honest, nobody reads Isaiah anymore, least of all a footnote like this. And that seems to be what Lucifer was to the old Jewish religion, an afterthought. He was in the text, but he wasn't an important figure. He certainly wasn't the final boss monster he's portrayed as in Judeo-Christian media today. Satan, on the other hand, is a whole different guy, and one interpretation, a swarm of guys. Satan means a number of things. It can mean adversary, it can mean prosecutor, but it can also refer to a whole class of angels whose job is to tempt humans. Yes, a whole class. The Bible contains multiple references to Satan. In the story of Balaam, the Moabite king Balak asks Balaam to curse the Jews. When Balaam goes with Balak's emissaries, God places an angel in his path referred to as a Satan, or an adversary to him. This is Satan being used as a common noun, not as a specific guy. But then there are two occasions in the Hebrew Bible where Satan actually appears as a specific person. Once is in the book of Zechariah, where the high priest is described standing before a divine angel, while Satan stands at his right ready to accuse him. The other is in the book of Job, where he plays a central role in the story as an angel in the divine court. Again, we see him as a prosecuting attorney, not as a fallen angel. In both of these texts, Satan appears alongside other angels whom he is clearly not at war with. Satan also appears as a specific individual in the Talmud, where he's responsible for causing the Jewish people to worship the golden calf while Moses is up on Mount Sinai. This version of Satan fits in nicely with the view my Jewish friends have, where he is simply an angel who tempts people to test their faith. And man, if this interpretation is correct, then the translations in the Gospels where Satan is the one who tempts Jesus in the desert get way more awkward. These two know each other when they're off the clock. They're probably friends when they're not on Earth. Now, it's worth mentioning that during the First Temple period from 700 to 586 BC, while there was no Prince of Darkness, there were demons called Se'erim. Some had names, like Belial or Azazel, but none could be called the King of Hell. So why is Satan sometimes a specific person, and other times just a word for adversary or prosecutor? Well, the word Elohim gets used in a similar manner, and while the word Elohim is used in older texts to refer to the Abrahamic God, it is also used to refer to spiritual beings that exist either partially or wholly outside the mortal world. It's believed that angels would qualify as Elohim under this interpretation. The word Elohim seems to be used much like the word mom. If there are a number of moms in the living room, you can refer to them all as moms and everyone knows what you mean. But if you were to go into the room and call for mom, your mom and everyone else would know you're referring to a specific mom. The same applies for Elohim, and maybe it applied to Satan. Old languages are like that sometimes. Psalms 82 verse 1 says, God, Elohim, stands in the assembly of God, El. In the midst of the judges, he judges. Psalm 95, on the other hand, declares God to be the king of all other gods. Now, when Jews believed in other gods, they didn't need to ask the questions like, where does evil or suffering come from? Because the answer was, evil gods. Simple. But then the Jews get rid of the idea of all other gods, declaring not only that their God is king, but that all other gods don't exist. So where does evil come from? Well, the Persians may have offered an answer in Zoroastrianism. Now, the differences between the original version of Zoroastrianism and the Zurvanite version that is more recognized today probably deserve their own video. But the part that's important for this topic is that in Zurvanism, there is an evil god named Ahriman who is just as omnipotent as the benevolent god Ahura Mazda, and this was the version that had become more popular in Persia when they became the overlords of Israel. In the original version of the religion, there is only one god named Ahura Mazda, and the only spirit opposing him is Angra Mainyu, whose name roughly translates to evil mind or evil spirit, but can just as easily be translated as evil idea. Angra Mainyu is almost identical to the idea of evil from Berserk, minus the God Hand, and while he is the primary source of all human suffering, he only exists because humans insist on believing that suffering has to have a reason, and we've created an enemy where there doesn't need to be one. I sometimes wonder if Jews today refuse to acknowledge that their religion once contained a devil or a similar figure because they're in denial, or if this is their way of fighting it. Because, like the idea of evil, the only way you could possibly hope to win against a man-made Prince of Darkness like that is to stop believing that it exists. And in a way, not having a bad guy to blame for your own shortcomings is kind of an important part of being a good person, regardless of what religion you follow, and it can help in trying to make the world a better place, less filled with sin and evil. And before I close my examination of the Jewish version of Satan, we have to talk about the Kabbalah, or the Jewish mysticism. This is where you find Jews believing not only in Satan, but an entire realm of evil populated by demons and spirits that exist parallel to the heavenly realm of God. You get things like Lilith in here, and a description of the realm called Sitra Achra, the other side, which sounds an awful lot like the upside down, and Satan in this context is often referred to as Samael or Satanel. You can also find descriptions for how Jewish priests can perform exorcisms, tales of Jews fending off demonic forces including a werewolf, and for most practicing Jews today, a big rubber stamp on this whole thing that says, not canon. But it still has to be acknowledged, in part because this might explain why so many Jews today deny believing in the devil, and why some even deny believing in demons, even though the belief that no evil spirits exist is newer to Judaism than the idea of the devil. If belief in these things drove an entire sect of Judaism to start practicing their own spells, and belief in the supernatural things so bizarre that they deserve their own video discussion, maybe it's best to put all these things away for good. These rabbi had started doing things that looked an awful lot like sorcery, and they were basing these things off of beliefs of esoteric mathematics that could allegedly decipher hidden codes in the Torah. And normal people look at the Torah and point to Exodus, where it says not to practice sorcery. Now let's look at the Christian version of Satan. For the sake of time, I'm only going to look at the canon version of Satan and Lucifer. Appearances in pop culture are too many and too diverse for me to go through in a single YouTube video. So remember when I mentioned that Lucifer and Satan are two different angels? Well, we don't know exactly which one the Bible is referring to when it talks about the devil. In fact, we can't even be certain that every place in the New Testament that refers to Satan actually means the specific Satan, or just the adversary. It's possible that wherever we see the Gospels mention Satan or the devil tempting Jesus in the desert, it's actually referring to Lucifer. When Jesus said that he saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven, he might have meant Lucifer. Or he might have meant that he just saw Satan punching his time clock before heading to work tempting people on earth. It isn't clear. One thing I can say for sure is that wherever the Bible refers to Lucifer, it means Lucifer, not Satan. Unfortunately, that's only in that one verse in Isaiah. Lucifer isn't mentioned by name anywhere else in the Bible in either the Old Testament or the New. The basic story Christianity takes as canon for Lucifer goes something like this. Lucifer is an archangel. He's God's favorite archangel. He's got a good thing going on, but then he decides he wants to usurp the big G man himself. And when he rallies some other angels to his rebellion, they all get defeated almost instantly and thrown into hell for all eternity. Going off the description in Isaiah, this seems to be a story shared with Judaism. In Old Testament times, the story seems to have been something of a fable, with the message that you shouldn't get so proud of yourself that you turn against God, and even if you are God's favorite, that won't stop him from dishing out punishment because he's a just God. It may have been present in Jewish teachings long before Christianity emerged, and it might have been one of those stories that people just don't care about anymore, like Methuselah. We might know his name, but nobody really cares about his story. He may have also been incorporated into the idea of a prince of evil when Judaism was adopting ideas from the Persians. At any rate, Christianity didn't invent the character or the idea that he was an evil, fallen angel. I think that the constant mixing of his name with the devil and the use of Satan as a term for an adversary is the reason why Christianity started viewing them as the same person. But the interpretation of Lucifer in Christianity as the devil is still radically different from how he's portrayed in Judaism. In Christianity, Lucifer is an extremely important person. He's also a tempter, just like Satan, which probably adds to the confusion. And in the Bible, Lucifer only has one weapon: lies. In video games, the devil is often shown as some sort of super powerful monster, with multiple heads and devastating magic. But in the Bible, Lucifer doesn't have any of these things. The only weapon he has from cover to cover of the Bible is words. In fact, if you interpret the temptations of Christ in the desert as a story where it's Lucifer trying to get Jesus to sin, then his best weapon, the one thing that he had that might have actually allowed him to win against God, is actually scripture taken out of context. Boy, I sure hope that isn't trying to tell us anything. This is also where we start to see the idea that Satan, Lucifer, or both are some kind of evil deal-makers offering Faustian contracts. Specifically, Jesus is offered all the wealth of all the kingdoms in the world if he will only bow down and worship whichever guy is in front of him. Now, many theologians for centuries have proposed that the devil was lying, and that he had neither the intention nor the ability to give Jesus all the wealth that he had promised. But this is the beginning of the devil's portrayal in Christianity that greatly deviates from anything that Judaism had come up with. At this point in time, the Jews had invented the idea of a prince of darkness who was more of a generic doomsday villain. He was really more focused on just causing as much harm and destruction as he could for evilness' sake. He didn't actually have something to gain from getting people to sin, or to give them their souls. And it's not really clear if the Jews ever believed the devil was Lucifer. When they were borrowing from Zoroastrianism, the devil was called Ashmedai, or Asmodeus, deriving from Ahriman. Later, after using the name Beelzebub to refer to fake gods, sometimes Beelzebub was used as a name for the devil. None of these guys were actually Lucifer, or the original Satan, although some were referred to as Satan since they were adversaries. There are references to Pharisees referring to the devil as Beelzebub in the Gospels, but most Jews consider these references as not canon, even for historical purposes, outside the theological ones. And it's not really clear if the Jews ever really believed the devil was Lucifer. But none of these other guys the Jews did believe in were quite like the devil of Christianity. Asmodeus wants people to sin because he's evil and just wants to see more evil in the world. Beelzebub is a bit closer, since he's a stand-in for false gods who want people to worship him instead of the Abrahamic God. But he wasn't a particularly skilled tempter who could draft contracts tailor-made for the person they're trying to corrupt. We don't see a cunning, manipulative trickster trying to get people to sin so that the devil can actually benefit from their corruption. So why is this Lucifer version of the devil in Christianity so big on making deals with people? Why is he so much more motivated than the Jewish Prince of Darkness, where he isn't just trying to do evil for the sake of evil, but he actually has something to gain from getting people to sin? Like he can actually steal their souls, which previous versions of the devil didn't even want and wouldn't know what to do with once they got them. This, sadly, is the part of the video that YouTube isn't going to like. If anything in this video is going to get people seriously upset, it's going to be this. To understand Christianity's radically different view of the devil, you have to know about the Roman Empire, and specifically the conditions Jews and Greeks were living in at the time that Christianity emerged. I talked about this a bit before in my article on the origins of witches, but the Romans had this thing called the dole. This was the ancient Roman equivalent of welfare. It's where we get phrases like doling out free stuff or going on the dole. And while it seems to have started out as just a way to provide relief for the poor, it eventually grew until it was the single biggest cost of the entire empire, eventually driving the government bankrupt and being one of the larger reasons for the fall of Rome. But Rome wasn't destroyed in a day. Referred to by Pulitzer Prize winner H.J. Haskell as the New Deal in Old Rome, the dole started out as a sort of government wheat program where they sold wheat at a lower price than the market value. But then a politician named Claudius ran for tribune on a free wheat platform and won. It turns out, as soon as politics becomes a game of who can offer voters the most free stuff, people start voting for the guy that's giving them more handouts. And once this relief was granted, it created a group of voters that no politician, not even the emperor himself, would dare oppose. They weren't just afraid of being voted out of office. A lot of politicians feared that riots would erupt if they so much as tried to reduce the government handouts through the dole. Of course, that didn't stop some politicians from running for office by promising even greater handouts in exchange for more votes. But a funny thing started to happen in Rome as the dole grew out of control. People who started taking the government handouts quickly became dependent upon them. It didn't take long for people to lose the skills that they might have had in the workplace and become unable to get off of the dole to go find a new job. It also led to a growing mass of people who were functionally unable to criticize the emperor or the Roman government out of fear that the handouts might stop. If a politician promised to fix massive problems in the empire, but he so much as hinted about the expenses of the dole needing to be reduced, the citizens couldn't vote for him. The guy running against him could have been a creepy deviant or an insane tyrant who wanted to start more stupid wars for no reason, and it wouldn't matter. Even the emperor himself would bow to the whims of the people on the dole, lest the other parts of the Roman government use it as an excuse to assassinate the emperor and call themselves heroes of the people. If you lived off of the dole, then whoever offered you more of someone else's money became your master. People who came to depend upon the dole lost the ability to think critically, lest it make them realize where the money they were being given was coming from, or how they had voted for a list of crooked politicians to get it. They would lose the ability to speak out against the government, and in some ways, speak about anything important, being reduced to nothing but small talk or pointless braying, since any speech with any thought behind it might threaten their meal ticket. None of the demons in Judaism did things like this. Satan the prosecutor didn't tempt people. Satan the tempter didn't actually want humans to be swayed by his temptations and had nothing to gain from it when people did. Beelzebub, Asmodeus, and other demons Jews believed in didn't operate like this at all. When Christianity first emerged, a new face of evil had appeared, and every previous devil was inadequate at showing his tricks. And remember, stories about evil spirits have been used all the time to warn about the kinds of real evils that actually exist. That seems to have been the original point of Lucifer, a warning against hubris. There is some room to debate whether it was the Jews under Roman occupation who first started using Lucifer as the new devil, or whether it was the Christians themselves. On the one hand, a big problem Jesus seems to have had with the Pharisees was the sheer number of them that were going along with Roman rules, and even maintaining a stable peace on the Romans' behalf to avoid a Jewish rebellion against the pagan invaders. On the other hand, the Jews lived under the Roman occupation long enough that they could easily have developed the concept of Lucifer as the new devil long before Christianity took off. It's highly unlikely that Christians came up with this idea entirely on their own. Finally, let me point out the difference between the early Christian Lucifer, where he was basically powerless, and the more modern concept where he has magic and stuff. Originally, Lucifer was supposed to be a fallen angel thrown into hell with no real power at all, because he's in prison. He might have the ability to send out his voice to whisper temptations to people, but he had no ability to actually grant people magic or anything like that. This was a feature, not a bug. The belief was that the devil made all sorts of promises that he could never actually keep, and had no intention of keeping them anyway. This was meant to reflect the fact that the Roman politicians would promise to hand out wealth that wasn't really theirs to give, having to steal it from someone else first. Or even just skipping that step and not even attempting to give people the things that they had promised as soon as they were in office. The devil lies. That's the one thing about him that you can count on in Christianity, and sometimes count on in Judaism when he shows up. Heck, even Satan lies when he's acting as a tempter. That's literally his job. Again, I talked about this some more in my witchcraft article, but the medieval church used to believe that the devil could not actually grant any of these promises. Best case scenario, he would drive you insane to make you think that you'd gotten what you'd bargained for. And once again, most of the belief that the devil had actual magical powers that he could give to witches so that they could steal men's wieners or something, or turn into werewolves, can be blamed on Heinrich Kramer, history's most influential nut. So if we take a step back, this whole map of Satan starting out as an angelic prosecutor slash adversary and eventually becoming king of hell is a bit of a roller coaster. And while all of this might be entertaining for historical purposes, how does any of this help you improve your writing? Well, one of the problems I see in a lot of fictional stories that feature a prophecy of some kind is that there isn't usually a lot of room for interpretation. There will be the occasional evil king who tries to prevent a prophecy from coming true by trying to kill the child fated to overthrow him, which will inevitably backfire when the kid now has a reason to go after the evil king. But come on, that story's older than Herod. But what if the prophecy was written at a time when the words they were using just didn't mean the same things when people try to read them later? What if the reason so many people doubt old prophecies is because they don't make sense when you try to translate them into modern languages? Remember, a lot of the confusion over Satan comes from the nature of the old Hebrew language being translated into English. It's not just that people sometimes fumble over the words and might translate adversary to mean enemy when it could have just meant something tamer like opponent. The whole idea of having the name of an angel also be a word that can mean something completely different isn't something we normally see in English. There might be some examples, but I can't think of any. Then there's the fact that a prophecy or other old scripture in a fictional world could have been deliberately interpreted one way when it was politically convenient, and then reinterpreted another way when the political situation changes. And if you want to use this idea in a more mundane situation with no supernatural or religious considerations, think about what would happen when people in the future start digging up the ruins of the United States. Imagine if people in the future dig up the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and they find the U.S. Constitution. And then they find the 19th Amendment, which lots of people today argue about but hardly anybody ever reads, and they find someone has written a message in their own blood saying, "Do not do this," next to the clause that talks about women's suffrage. Some people would immediately assume it means don't do what the 19th Amendment actually says, which is blocking states from denying people the right to vote on the grounds of sex, or allowing Congress to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Does this message mean don't give women voting rights at all? Does it mean don't give Congress the power to enforce a clause like this by whatever they think is appropriate legislation? Does it mean don't tell states who to give voting rights to? Let the states decide for themselves. What good is a message like this if it's dug up by people who don't live in a society with a clear distinction between state rights and federal rights? And what if they live in a monarchy? And then there's going to be someone who asks, hang on a minute, are we supposed to believe that someone was bleeding out and in their dying moments they decide to crawl to this specific document and write a coherent message before they succumb to blood loss? This is probably an elaborate prank. And that would be a perfectly reasonable response in both a sci-fi or a fantasy setting. Often I see stories where people don't believe in the fabled prophecy of the hero, or the reasons why the ancient civilization collapsed, or why people might not even know about the older civilizations at all. Rarely do I ever see any explanation as to why everyone except a handful of protagonists seem to be in the know about why the ancient superweapon is dangerous, and sometimes it completely breaks the suspension of disbelief if it isn't explained. The story of how Satan, Lucifer, and the devil have evolved over time is a prime example of how things like that could occur. Maybe people don't know about the ancient flying city in the sky because stories about it changed over time. Maybe no one believes in them anymore because the fantastical elements got overplayed and the truth became shrouded in myth. And maybe some religious orders started banning mention of the weirder parts of their own history because they got so out of hand that they became ridiculous, and lost sight of the important parts of their religious beliefs in the first place. And in the process of sweeping over parts of their own history, they might have wiped out the warnings their ancestors tried to give them about the real monsters that are actually out there. Man, I really wish I could make videos like this faster. I'm doing this entirely on my own, juggling it against writing my next book, my job, and just life in general. But I am in the market for an editor, and if you know anyone I should check out, by all means let me know in the comments below. And if you like content like this video, give me a like, subscribe, and even check out Heroes of Jinan over on Amazon. Thank you.